the road. Going to be back in my good old-fashioned in front of my bookshelves pretty soon. Last day here on the California trip. I'm actually in San Francisco right now. I spoke at an event earlier today in Palo Alto. It went great. I saw a few of you there, and so it was even better. That said, folks, as always, we're going to be jumping into the questions around the halfway point. There's some big stories to go into tonight. Basically, right now, I talk a lot about what's happening with ISIS and the Taliban and with Afghanistan, then also some stories here in the U.S. as well. Right now, they're saying that thousands of ISIS terrorists actually escaped the prisons in Afghanistan. So in addition to the Taliban getting the military equipment of basically almost a fully armed army, everything short of main battle tanks and fighter jets, just about everything else they got now. In addition to that, now you have ISIS fighters who are in the prisons in Afghanistan who are now running free. And this is going to be lending to the bigger issue of, well, the new terror war, which we're likely falling into now, which is not against the Taliban, but against ISIS, including very likely fighting against ISIS in Afghanistan, and ironically, maybe even fighting alongside the Taliban. It's going to be bizarre going forward. I'll go into this, folks, a lot to talk about. Also, we've seen the first signs of this now. The United States has launched an airstrike in Afghanistan, allegedly against a vehicle that was heading to launch a terror attack at the Kabul airport. And so it started. We were expecting it. It's happening now. Real quick, Corey, I mentioned fighter jets. What I meant was that we gave the Taliban just about every type of military equipment you would need to run a full-fledged army, with the exception of main battle tanks and fighter jets. But we did give them helicopters. We gave them armored vehicles with weapons, just not main battle tanks or fighter jets, essentially. All right, folks, that said, always a lot to go into. As always, around the halfway point, we'll jump into some questions. So if you do have questions, leave them in the chat. If you write question at the front of your question, it does make it easier for us to find them. So please consider doing that. Also, I mentioned before that we're doing this new series, this Dark Origins of Communism series. We were supposed to have episode 3 out this weekend. It's been delayed a bit, so it's going to be out next Saturday. So be sure to look for that next Saturday. It's going to be exclusively on Epoch TV. And we'll show you a quick trailer right now of what we're working on with that. And again, folks, Epoch TV is our uncensored video platform. If you want to support Crossroads, that's a great way to do it. And also, if you just want some great content, we have all kinds of channels there, all kinds of shows, some really good content, our exclusive interviews, and also our special features like this one. We'll show you now what we're working on with it. Communism is a belief in the destruction of belief. It destroys religion wherever it goes. So who is the unholy father of communism? François Noël Gracchus Babeuf. The French Revolution would be remembered for its unjust bloodshed, killing over 300,000 people. It was a period known as the Reign of Terror. All right, well, I'm very excited about it. Already we have episode 1 and 2 out. So if you have Epoch TV, or if you want to check it out, all you need is an email address for a free trial. We do have the first 2 episodes of that currently on Epoch TV, so be sure to check it out. And again, episode 3 is coming out next Saturday. All right, folks, let's jump into the first stories for the night. I want to talk about what's happening with ISIS. And so first story here, it says this: thousands of ISIS terrorists released in Afghanistan as U.S. expects future attacks, according to the Pentagon. And it says here that several thousand ISIS-K terrorists, this is a sub-branch of ISIS, ISIS-K terrorist members escaped Afghan prisons when the country's government fell and the Taliban took over earlier this month, said Pentagon spokesman John Kirby on Friday. And he said, clearly, it's in the thousands, talking about the number of ISIS terrorists who are now escaping from these prisons. Thousands of them. He said this in a response to a question about number of ISIS terrorists who escaped just in recent days. The Taliban, he said, emptied the prison at Bagram Air Base, located outside Kabul, which had ISIS members. And so this is an important development, because the Taliban itself is talking about making sure that Afghanistan does not fall into basically a staging base for terror attacks, and also that there are no terror attacks in Afghanistan. But the Taliban released the terrorists, even though they themselves are also terrorists. They released the ISIS terrorists. So are they fighting them, or are they allowing them to operate? They released thousands of them. And so this is one of the first big discrepancies we're seeing with this right now. Now, the United States, he added, this is Kirby, believes there are specific credible threats against Kabul airport. He said, we would expect future attempts against the facility. He said the terrorist group, which has its origins in Syria and Iraq, has operated in Afghanistan since at least 2015. They claim the responsibility for the attack on the Kabul airport that left over a dozen Americans dead, American service members dead, something around the area of 60 Afghanis dead as well, killed, and many more wounded. Now, ISIS-K, this variant of ISIS, is also known as Islamic State Khorasan. It's an antiquated term describing the region that encompasses Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other Central Asian nations. Reports have said that ISIS-K is primarily comprised of disgruntled former Taliban members. The two terrorist groups have fought each other during recent sporadic bursts or fighting over the past several years. In 2017, President Donald Trump actually attacked them, you might remember. Does anyone remember the Moab? Well, it says here, President Donald Trump ordered a U.S. military airstrike in 2017 that dropped the largest conventional bomb in the U.S. arsenal, known as the mother of all bombs, the largest one next to an atomic weapon, which was called the Moab. And he dropped it on caves that were being used by ISIS-K in Afghanistan. ISIS-K in 2020 also attacked an Afghan prison that left at least 29 people dead, and they also freed a number of their own members as well. A suicide bomber drove a vehicle filled with explosives into the prison's main gate before other ISIS terrorists moved through the gap, firing on the prison guards there. So what does this mean? Remember now, the Taliban has taken over Afghanistan. We gave it to them, essentially. The U.S. could have easily launched a few attacks on basically a few, handful of guys in pickup trucks driving through the country in the open desert, taking over different villages, claiming it as their own once again, and then rolling into Kabul, where they then gained control of the area. Nothing was done to stop them by the United States. And the Afghan security forces, fled before they arrived, meaning there was very little fighting done to stop them from taking over the country. The United States now is looking like it's going to recognize the Taliban as basically the official government of Afghanistan. They're also claiming, in some regards, that the Taliban is basically on the track to, they claim, not launch terror attacks, and also maybe show some respect for women and other groups in the country. We're not really seeing signs of that yet. No, they're still doing the same old thing they've always done. The big question now is going to be, will the Taliban fight ISIS? Because right when America was pulling out its troops and rescuing a lot of normal Afghanis as well now, I'll be getting into that, a whole lot of them. They're saying maybe 500,000, it's looking like, are going to be evacuated to other countries and the U.S. That ISIS terrorists went in, launched a terrorist attack, one person blew themselves up, and now we're pulled back into the war on terror. And as we're being pulled back into the war on terror, ironically now we're kind of working with the Taliban and fighting ISIS. And so it does appear that things have worked both ways for the CCP and for the Taliban. The Chinese Communist Party gets to work hand in hand with the Taliban to build critical infrastructure in Afghanistan. They're going to be doing a lot with that, very likely. At the same time, the Taliban gets to have not only Afghanistan, but also a whole lot of U.S. military equipment that we left there for them. And in addition to that, now we're going to continue launching our war on terror, it seems, just in a very different way. And so this is the bizarre state Afghanistan's now fallen into. All right, folks, that said, I mentioned before that we are totally demonetized by YouTube. We did try to get our monetization back. They told us basically indefinitely we're defunded. But we do have sponsors. And tonight's episode is brought to you by Secure. Now, with over 155 million Americans affected by data leaks in 2020, the average American also had their personal data stolen about 4 times over the year. which means that you and I both have probably had our data stolen at least a few times. People get anxious because they can't protect their online data or their online activity. This is especially so when it comes to emailing and messaging, but there's now a new email and messenger app called Secure, that's spelled S-E-K-U-R, that can give privacy legitimately and security for sending emails and messages. Secure's server and data center are located in Switzerland. And that's important because it's only in Switzerland, right, that they have the strictest data privacy laws in the world. They can't just go in there and request your data and they're going to hand it over. There's a whole process for it. And it's very hard for them to do it. Now, Secure is also the only private and secure messaging and email app that doesn't rely on big tech companies like Amazon, Google, or Microsoft, which is important on a few different levels, which I'll get into later in this episode. But it also means they're not subject to the Intrusive Cloud Act, which means that basically these U.S. tech platforms are subject to searches by the government, essentially. Because Secure is not located in the U.S. and does not use any kind of U.S. technology, they're not subject to that American Act. Secure does not ask for your phone number, does not mine your data, and also does not upload your contacts like all other applications do. Secure Messenger functions by adding people you know and adding their secure numbers. You can still chat also with non-secure members by sending them an invite. And in this way, you are protected from hackers getting into your phone. You also have full privacy on the app. Now, it costs only $5 for the Messenger or $10 for the email and Messenger package. You can also get a free 7-day trial. You can visit secure.com, and you can also use the promo code Joshua to get 25% off. So big thanks out to Secure for sponsoring tonight's episode. All right, folks, I want to talk a bit more what's happening in Afghanistan, then I want to talk about a few other issues as well, especially some of the virus news. For example, new details on the investigation into the origin of the virus and news coming out now that our own intelligence services weren't able to really make an assessment on where the virus comes from either because China is not cooperating with them. And why would China not be cooperating with them? Maybe we have the answer to that. But first, folks, let's talk about what else is happening in Afghanistan. First off, it says here, U.S. airstrikes. This is important because this is the first attack we've launched in Afghanistan after trying to pull out of the country, and that's still ongoing. But again, we're now getting pulled into, it seems to be the case, a new war on terror focused on ISIS, especially because they released ISIS prisoners from the Afghan prisons. But it says here, U.S. airstrike hit suicide bomber in vehicle going to Kabul airport. And it says, a U.S. military spokesman confirmed that a U.S. military airstrike targeted a suicide bomber who tried to attack the Kabul airport on August 29th, meaning today, amid the American-led evacuation of the airport. Zabihullah Mujahid, the main Taliban spokesman, had earlier told the Associated Press and other outlets that the strike occurred on August 29th, which is interesting because here you have the Taliban spokesperson commenting on the U.S. airstrike against ISIS, meaning that it does seem to be the case that the Taliban is at the very least cooperating with the United States in some regard with this, and they are helping us in some ways, facilitating people going to the airport, although there are some discrepancies in the reporting on that. But at the very least, in their claims to be fighting ISIS, they do seem to be reporting on it at least. Now, U.S. military officials haven't gone on record to confirm the strike, although, again, the Taliban spokesperson did confirm it. The Epoch Times contacted the Department of Defense for comment, nothing from them yet. Unnamed U.S. officials did tell Reuters and other news outlets today that a military strike was launched against a possible suicide car bomber who was targeting the airport. Witnesses told Al Jazeera that they heard a loud explosion near the facility, and footage showed a black smoke cloud rising into the sky. The attack was later confirmed by U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM, one of their spokespersons, and said this: U.S. military forces conducted a self-defense, unmanned, over-the-horizon airstrike today on a vehicle in Kabul, eliminating an imminent ISIS-K threat to Hamad Karzai International Airport. That's according to Captain Bill Urban, CENTCOM spokesperson, telling this to reporters. And he added, "We are confident we successfully hit the target. Significant secondary explosions from the vehicle indicated the presence of a substantial amount of explosive material. We are assessing the possibilities of civilian casualties, though we have no indications at this time. Now, the incident comes after the Pentagon confirmed that it killed 2 other ISIS-K terrorists in Afghanistan over the weekend. And so here now you have what seems to be the case of America reigniting the war on terror, but now we're kind of working with the Taliban and we're fighting against ISIS. A very strange development. But also on this as well, keep in mind that the Taliban, the guys were kind of fighting alongside, ironically on this, also were the ones who released thousands of ISIS members from the prisons in Afghanistan, some of whom were a part of ISIS-K, which has also fought with the Taliban, which makes it even more strange. And also, as the Taliban is working to go hand in hand with the Chinese Communist Party, working diplomatically to very likely work on other programs there, such as building critical infrastructure, which is going to be interesting to see how China positions itself, as it's very likely going to be risking at least getting pulled into the war on terror as well, especially because it's working in Iran, it's working in Pakistan, the Balochistan region, it's working in Afghanistan, it's working in other countries, many of which have factions that don't get along with each other. Some strange incidents happening right now. I'll keep you updated on this. Now, on that note as well, what is the Taliban doing right now? They're going around and telling people now it's time to surrender their firearms. Let's explain this. It says here, Taliban demand that Afghans hand over guns and ammo within a week. It says here, a spokesman for the Taliban said that Afghans who have government-issued weapons, ammunition, or vehicles need to hand them over or face punishment. And they said, all those who have government goods, equipment, weapons, ammunition, or vehicles need to hand them over to the relevant department. This is according to, again, the Taliban spokesman on Twitter. And the Taliban has an official spokesman on Twitter, while Trump, for example, was kicked off of Twitter. This is according to a translation of his tweet. The weapons need to be given to the Taliban within a week, they're claiming. And he said the handover is necessary, so there is, quote, no need for the offenders to be prosecuted or dealt with legally if the weapons are discovered. Now, it's not clear what will happen to individuals who are found to still possess firearms or ammunition after the deadline is over. Also unclear is whether the gun confiscation plan entails weapons that were not provided by the Afghan government, which collapsed earlier this month. Now, important part on this, where do you think most of the guns in Afghanistan come from? Well, they either come from the U.S. arming the Mujahideen, they come from the Soviets arming the Northern Alliance prior to that, they come from America later arming the Northern Alliance, and other groups arming the Taliban, which was mostly the old Mujahideen fighters. And it also comes from us arming the local Afghan army and other efforts like this. And so, frankly, they can pretty much say that most guns are from some government in Afghanistan. Vehicles, another issue. But they can really say that most guns probably come from some government, because so many governments have supplied guns to the Afghanis. When it comes to ammunition, how are they going to prove the origin of ammunition? That's going to be a tough one. And so it does seem to be the case, at least in my analysis, that their claims that they're looking for guns and ammunition and vehicles solely provided by the government, they're not even specifying which government, that this is very likely a much larger issue of them just seizing firearms and ammunition in general. Now, one issue I'd mentioned previously, and I'll say it again, is that what's happening in Afghanistan right now is the Taliban is, again, a terrorist organization. They're a terrorist organization that's now taking the role of the government of Afghanistan. This is a terrorist organization that, well, really, if they're anti-terrorist forces that don't want terrorists running the country, they're very likely going to be labeled as terrorists because they're fighting against the established government. The Northern Alliance and members of it are already showing they're going to be doing this yet again. Some of this does tie to older tribal wars happening in the country. And so a lot of very strange things happening with this. A lot more to go into with this, folks. Also, in addition to this, there's a prominent Chinese scholar describing the Taliban as Afghanistan's People's Liberation Army, which is very strange because the Chinese Communist Party right now is putting itself basically on par with the Taliban and its own propaganda. going against Taiwan and other countries, for example, claiming that the Taliban is basically the group they're going to be working with, and they're praising the Taliban, while at the same time criticizing the United States for allowing the country to fall under Taliban control. So again, they're still playing this narrative on both sides. Also, an important update on this, 500,000 Afghans, according to the United Nations, are very likely going to be seeking refuge in other countries. This is the current prediction. And so you do have a great exodus taking place right now from Afghanistan to other countries. Many of these people are going to be sent to the United States as well. They're looking at around 50,000, I believe, currently. But also to other countries, you're going to be watching this. This is very likely going to be a repeat in some regards of what we saw with Syria, where the war in Syria pushed a lot of Syrian refugees to illegally immigrate to most of Europe, where you had people pouring across the borders into European countries. You're going to see a lot of this happening with Afghanistan as well now, but also not just people coming and crossing illegally, but actual resettlement efforts. And so this is currently happening as well. At the same time, the White House is saying that not every Afghan who wants to get out of the country is going to be able to do so. So we'll see how this develops, folks, and I'll keep you updated on the big stories with this. Now let's talk about what's happening with the virus, because there's a few updates with this as well. According to the story here, it says U.S. intelligence officials, and remember as well that during the Trump administration, you had U.S. intelligence assessments talking about where the virus might have come from. Based on the U.S. intelligence, analysis, they did assess. It seemed to be the case that there was a possibility the virus came from this laboratory in Wuhan, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And now they're saying that the reports are inconclusive, mainly because they can't finalize their investigations, because they can't get into China and actually check things. So it says here, U.S. intelligence officials inconclusive on COVID-19 origins, say China is unwilling to cooperate. And it says here, the 17-agency U.S. intelligence community announced on August 27th that it has reached an inconclusive assessment regarding the origins of COVID-19, including whether the virus leaked from a Chinese lab. This follows a 90-day investigation that was ordered earlier this year by President Joe Biden, according to a summary of the findings. And so an important update on this. This is not the intelligence assessment that was done under the Trump administration. That assessment was never released. This is the follow-up assessment done under the Biden administration. And while the Trump administration one did seem to point to a possible lab origin, the Biden one is showing to come up inconclusive. Now it says here, and we never saw the Trump era one publicly, it's important to note, although we did hear reports based on it. Now it says here importantly, agency officials said in a report on their findings that the Chinese regime is still unwilling to cooperate in their probe to obtain answers about the origin of the virus. The regime, the Chinese Communist Party, would need to fully cooperate with the U.S. investigation in order to determine whether or not the virus came from a laboratory. And they said this in the report. China's cooperation most likely would be needed to reach a conclusive assessment on the origins of COVID-19. And they say Beijing, however, continues to hinder the global investigation, resist sharing information, and blames other countries, including the United States. They say these actions reflect in part China's government's own uncertainty about where an investigation could lead, as well as the frustrations the international community is using the issue to exert political pressure on China. Now, we won't go too deep into it, folks, but frankly, we saw the WHO's attempt working alongside Chinese Communist Party officials to prove the virus didn't come from a lab because they went there to China to try to prove otherwise. They were never allowed access to the laboratory. The research that was given to them was given by Chinese Communist Party officials, meaning that basically when there was an assessment through the World Health Organization into the origins of the virus, it was essentially the Chinese Communist Party trying to prove it didn't come from a laboratory. The problem with that, well, the information they provided was not substantial enough to prove it did not come from a laboratory. Now, if all the king's horses and all the king's men can't prove it didn't come from a laboratory, what does that tell you, right? Well, we'll have to see. It does seem to be the case, though, that evidence is suggesting a possible lab leak. We had an exclusive story we mentioned just the other night, you might remember, where we talked about something very interesting, which is, do you remember early on when the virus was first spreading, right? When this virus was first spreading, what was happening? There were Chinese scientists who publicly released the virus sequence. They publicly released the sequence of the virus. What happened to those scientists? They were disappeared. They were punished by the Chinese Communist Party. And the information they released publicly was scrubbed from the internet. They got rid of it, right? The whole thing got disappeared. What that data shows, though, because the data is still publicly available, what that data shows, which we did an exclusive story on, is that there's something very strange in it. The sequence of the virus, meaning the patients who had the virus originally in China, also had a virus that was biologically engineered coming from a Canadian laboratory. Now, that virus that was biologically engineered from that Canadian laboratory was one of the two viruses that had been taken and illegally transferred by a Chinese scientist at that laboratory in Canada to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, according to reports. Meaning that, frankly, if patients, the early patients of COVID-19, the ones whose data was used to make the public sequence of the virus, if the people catching the early virus not only had COVID-19, but this very specific biologically engineered virus from a Canadian laboratory that had been leaked to the Wuhan laboratory, what does that tell you? Well, folks, either it means that COVID-19 was a natural virus and somehow the people who caught the virus also caught a virus that somehow escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology laboratory, the one that had been legally given to them by this Chinese scientist and was biologically engineered in Canada. Well, I don't know. It doesn't seem very likely to me. At the very least, that does show that maybe there was a lab, but there was a leak at the lab regardless of COVID-19 in addition to the one that we suspect. And so some very strange stuff happening with this. One sec, folks. Now, that said, too, I want to talk about a few other points. Right now as well, you have large-scale protests taking place in many parts of the world. Right now, the biggest ones are happening in Germany, in France, also some large-scale ones in Australia taking place, but very large-scale protests, tens of thousands of people in Germany and France against the COVID-19 lockdowns and the mandates they're trying to push through. Also, in addition to this, you do have some smaller-scale protests here in the United States. But it does seem to be the case that people are kind of drawing a line in the sand. Whereas, one of the big questions is this kind of boiling the frog, kind of comparison where you can put a frog in water and turn the heat up, and the frog's going to stay in there until it boils. They're kind of testing where the threshold is with people. They're finding out how much people will tolerate before they start pushing back. How much longer people will accept lockdowns, how much longer people will accept mask mandates, whether people will accept being injected or having their rights taken from them unless they choose to get injected with a vaccine that they may not want to get. I think we're now seeing the line in the sand. Tens of thousands of people protesting, and a lot of people aren't having it anymore. Now, in addition to this, the CDC is making a new law here in the United States. And they're making it so that if you're an immigrant to the United States and you want to apply for a green card, you need to get the vaccine. Now, the important part with this is this is specific about green card holders, meaning this does not apply to people who are illegally immigrating to this country, many of whom are not being tested whatsoever and are also being resettled throughout the United States as part of this program. But the other big update with this is that, of course, the Supreme Court has now ruled that they're going to reinstate the Remain in Mexico policy from the Trump administration. So some different parts with this. Let's go into what's happening with the green cards. Now it says here, green card applicants will soon need COVID-19 vaccine to be eligible, according to the CDC. And it says most green card applicants will need to get vaccinated against the CCP virus and have proof of the vaccination to be eligible for permanent residency in the United States effective October 1st, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC. The new CDC guidance would apply to immigrants living in the United States seeking to apply for a green card. And the CDC is stating on its website, COVID-19 vaccination now meets the criteria for required vaccinations. Hear that, folks? And is a requirement for applicants eligible for the vaccine. Hear that, folks? That's the important keyword there. Key phrase here. COVID-19 vaccination now meets the criteria for required vaccinations. That's a statement from the CDC. Now, the CDC is using that statement specifically to require vaccinations for people who are trying to get green cards in the United States. This means legal immigrants, not illegal immigrants. People who are trying to apply for green cards in the United States are basically under this. One important thing with this, though, is that typically these things expand. If the CDC is doing that based on the idea, as they say, that the COVID-19 vaccination now meets the criteria for required vaccinations, that's a statement they could apply to other people as well. And so we'll have to see how this develops, but currently that's where things are at with it. At the same time, you might be seeing a whole lot more censorship taking place. And I want to go into questions in just a bit, but I'll go over one more story here. Google is now telling the Australian government something interesting. And this is important because it's going to affect all of us very likely, because you probably use some kind of Google product, whether it's Google search or otherwise. YouTube, for example, is a Google product. Google search is a Google product. Google Docs, many other programs. Google is telling the Australian government that has gotten a $1 billion global campaign to censor COVID-19, what they call misinformation. Here, folks, a $1 billion global campaign. So in other words, while the update is coming from Australia, this is a global campaign. And it says here, Google reported to the Australian federal government that it has removed around 800,000 YouTube videos concerning COVID-19 and 275 million COVID-19 apps from across its platform as part of its $1 billion, that's in Australian money, so that's about 726 million US, global campaign to counter COVID-19 misinformation, as they're calling it. Now, it has also launched a US $3 million fund to wipe out alleged vaccine misinformation. So people spreading information that they don't like about the vaccine, well, they also have a $3 million fund to wipe out that information. Now, Google regards official government information from national health departments or the World Health Organization, the WHO, as reliable sources. And meanwhile, the WHO, the World Health Organization, has noted that information changes over time as the world, quote, learns more about the virus. What does this mean? When they talk about virus misinformation, they're not necessarily talking about false information about the virus. They're talking about narratives that go against the official government or World Health Organization narrative. And even the World Health Organization itself is noting that news and information changes. In other words, what information that they approve changes based on what we learn about the virus. The problem is, how do you learn more about the virus? And public debate and public discrepancy is not allowed. They say trust the science, as I'm sure many of you have heard. Trust the science. Well, what happens when scientists disagree with it? Well, the scientists who disagree with it get deplatformed. The scientists who disagree with it get canceled. The scientists who disagree with it get written off as being conspiracy theorists and so on, meaning this is not about science. This is specifically about government policy and World Health Organization policy, which may not be true, as they themselves are acknowledging that information may change as more information comes out. In other words, this is not about misinformation. It's about anything that would challenge the official prevailing narrative they are pushing. In other words, the only discussion that is being allowed online to these private companies about the virus are official government voices, regardless of the science, regardless of the evidence, regardless of medical data, regardless of anything. If the World Health Organization or official government bodies are not saying it, they're not going to allow it. And they have a very large-scale program, again, $726 million global campaign, plus a $3 million campaign to wipe out alleged vaccine misinformation, as they're calling it. And this is happening on other platforms as well. And briefly as well, Twitter also permanently suspended a New York Times journalist for trying to challenge these vaccine narratives also. And so this is no longer just even a right-left issue. This is, again, New York Times, by no means right-wing in any way, just talking about information on the virus that they're essentially canceling. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into some questions now. So if you do have questions, leave them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. Real quick also, though, just once again, if you want to support Crossroads, please check out Epoch TV. That's epochtv.com/Crossroads. You can find the link to that in the description below this video, and you can find the link to that in the chat. And again, folks, Epoch TV is our uncensored video platform. We have Crossroads there. The lives are there. We also have our exclusive interviews, our exclusive documentaries, our exclusive special features. We have my virus documentary I did 17 months ago, which has been vindicated. A perfect example of this type of censorship. You might remember, folks, more than a year ago when I did this investigation to the origins of the virus and pointed to the possible leak from the Wuhan laboratory. Well, that video was canceled after getting over 100 million views on Facebook and other channels, declared as fake news by these organizations, but vindicated over time. Even though they said it was fake news at first, almost everything we reported in there has now been proven true. Just as a perfect example of how this canceling of information and canceling of research and canceling of investigations actually works. Legitimate investigation, legitimate scientific research is being called misinformation if it does not align with what the government is approving to be stated. And again, you can watch that documentary also on Epoch TV. So folks, if you want to support Crossroads, check out Epoch TV. If you don't have an account yet, all you need for a free trial is an email address, so check it out. I'll show you a quick trailer now of what we're working on over there.
The virus, it cannot be stressed enough that the virus did not cause a global economic contraction. What caused the contraction was politicians panicking. The virus had been spreading for months. It had been in the news for months. Yet U.S. shares in the stock market and the U.S. stock market continued to hit all-time highs. And so it was a signal that free people were responding and gradually taking more precautions against a spreading virus. It was only when politicians panicked and essentially took away our freedoms, took away the genius of the marketplace, whereby we dealt with something on our own without having command and control imposed on us, that markets started to correct and the global economy contracted. Command and control always shrinks an economy, whereas freedom tends to correlate with growth.
All right, folks. So again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat, and it helps if you write question on the question, just so we can find it more easily. And let's jump into the questions now. So first question is from the one and only Pinky, and always good seeing you here. You said, question, Code Monkey, and this is, I believe, one of the founders of 8chan, I believe. He's also been publishing a lot of research on the virus and so on. You say, Code Monkey says the things going on in Afghanistan and the media talking about it is a distraction to get people to focus on something other than the audits. What do you think? So as we speak right now, the Arizona audits into the election are currently wrapping up. We'll see what comes out from them. But you do have a lot of, well, you're going to have the research that they found coming out publicly very soon. The Arizona audits, of course, we're looking at the discrepancies in Maricopa County. We'll see what comes out from it. Based on that, we're going to learn about, well, if anything wrong, if any kind of fraud did take place in the 2020 elections. Also on that, based on their findings, we can expect a few things to happen. We can expect other states to look at the findings from the audit that take place in Arizona and determine whether they want to hold similar audits in their states. Remember that something like 18 different states had delegates of some kind go and watch how the audits were being done in Arizona, and would at the very least consider, because it's not necessarily a whole of party effort, would at the very least consider trying to push through to get audits held in their state. That's one thing we can expect. The other thing we can expect is a large-scale campaign to basically shut down and attack it. You're going to be watching very likely the Department of Justice filing more lawsuits, trying to go after organizations looking into the basically discrepancies with the elections in 2020. You can also expect them to go after states putting into place stronger election laws based on those findings. Currently, they're doing this. For example, they're trying to claim that having voter ID is somehow racist. A very strange argument because it contradicts the whole vaccine mandate policy now. If folks, hear me out, if having an ID requirement to cast your vote on who's going to lead this country and who's going to be your local representative, if having an ID is a requirement to vote is considered racist, meaning you need to have a driver's license or something basic just to show you're not voting twice and you are who you say you are. If that's racist, then is it also racist to deny people access to restaurants and venues and gyms if they don't have a vaccine ID? Is that not racist? So this is going to be one of the interesting arguments and, well, frankly, contradictions we're going to be hearing getting debated because it contradicts itself. The Department of Justice is trying to use that as their narrative to go after voting ID. And we can expect a lot more of that to happen as the findings of the audits are released. Now, can we prove, because you're talking about Code Monkey's claims that the essential war in Afghanistan is, or the pullout and what's happening now, is essentially distraction from that? I don't think I could prove that it's an intentional distraction. We could say by effect it is distracting from it. I don't think we could say that we could prove that it's an intentional distraction, but we can say the timing of it does work out so that it is in effect distracting from the news about the audits. We can say that. And so basically that's what we can show, right? Another question here is from, this is from Joey Dresbach. You said, question, any evidence that the Biden administration did this to help China give Afghanistan to them? China seems to be the winner of this mess, the big winner of this mess. I don't think we could prove, again, that they intentionally did it. I don't think we could in any way prove that Biden intentionally wanted to give Afghanistan to China. We can say that in effect that is happening, though. The effect of what they've done is that they've essentially given Afghanistan to China. The Chinese Communist Party showed signs of this early on, so we knew even prior to the pullout that this was going to be taking place. The Chinese Communist Party welcomed the Taliban delegates to China for a meeting prior to this whole U.S. pullout. So we knew ahead of time that the Chinese Communist Party was planning to work diplomatically with the Taliban. As that happened as well, the Chinese Communist Party is very likely going to be doing a lot of infrastructure projects with the Taliban. The pet project they really want is very likely going to be building an oil pipeline from Iran to Xinjiang, also known as East Turkestan, where the Chinese Communist Party is persecuting Muslim Uyghurs. The Chinese Communist Party is also very likely going to be working to develop critical infrastructure in Afghanistan and very likely helping the Taliban put into place the same types of totalitarian social controls that it uses in its own country. What are some of the problems with that? Well, I'll get into that just a bit. Now, the issue with the U.S. pullout is this. I was saying, you might remember, as this was taking place, and I guess it's still taking place, that basically, if the Taliban, basically the Chinese Communist Party has two different agendas. One is to keep the United States engaged in a permanent war in that region. The Chinese Communist Party has stated its intention to keep the United States engaged in 4 different wars. They had public reporting on this. In fact, one of the main advisors to Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, was saying this publicly. They want to keep the United States engaged in 4 different wars. Now, the war on terror is one of those wars. The war on terror is one of those wars. I was saying that we can expect a couple things to happen with the U.S. evacuations from Afghanistan. One would be as we send more troops to Afghanistan, 6,000 to help with the evacuations. All it's going to take for us to get pulled back into a war is the Taliban launching attacks on U.S. forces. That's one possibility, dragging us back into the Afghan war while all the world's eyes are on Afghanistan. The other big possibility is that China would not want that to happen because they'd want to maintain the Taliban in Afghanistan as basically their political pet project, a propaganda pet project. Because if the Chinese Communist Party can build critical infrastructure in Afghanistan, if they can create social stability by helping the Taliban crush opposition, which is how they would do it, by working hand in hand with the terrorists, that they would crush opposition and call it social stability, basically. That'd be something the CCP is very likely looking to do. What is interesting now is that, well, it seems to be the case that China is getting both of these. The Chinese Communist Party is both getting the Taliban, getting the United States stuck in a war, it seems to be the case, in Afghanistan, maintaining the war on terror, because it wasn't the Taliban, but ISIS, allegedly, ISIS-K, released from the prisons by the Taliban, that launched the attacks. Meaning that rather than fighting the Taliban, we're going to be fighting ISIS. While the Chinese Communist Party works with the Taliban to help build their own infrastructure and turn Afghanistan into the pet project. China got it both ways. They got both ways. The other side of this is that we did leave a lot of military equipment for the Taliban. Basically, the Taliban now is a fully armed, modern army. They have just about every kind of military equipment with the exception of main battle tanks, at least not Abrams tanks, it seems. And they don't have fighter jets, but they have just about everything else. And so China got it both ways. China got everything it wanted. The Chinese Communist Party got everything it wanted. The Taliban got everything it wanted. And the U.S. lost out in both ways. We lost Afghanistan. Our veterans are very unhappy about this. American lives are being lost in new terrorist attacks. ISIS has been released in the thousands from Afghan prisons. We handed off a lot of military equipment to a terrorist organization, which is now launching persecutions against its own people, working hand in hand with the Chinese Communist Party. And frankly, America is looking very bad on the world stage amidst all of this. America lost out in every regard. China made out in every regard. And the Taliban made out in every regard. That's essentially where things are at with it. Can we prove, though, that that was intentional? At the very least, it was very negligent. At the very least, it was a terrible miscalculation, and the miscalculation that was obvious because even the Trump administration was talking about how the Taliban was very likely to take over the country after the pullout. In other words, every assessment said this was going to happen, and somehow they just ignored every assessment. At the very least, it's very negligent. Let's put it that way. At the very least. Another question here. This is from Gloria Elenes. He said, Arizona audit, what's happening? Currently, they're wrapping it up. We should hopefully see results on it soon. And again, from there, see what happens with other audits taking place across the U.S., whether they happen or not. Another question here is from Cameron Bacon. You said, Joshua, do you predict there's going to be the huge scandal surrounding the California recall election? It appears there's already fraud and interference taking place. Californians are likely watching the election very closely, right? So as we speak right now, Governor Newsom in California is at the very least there's a vote now to see whether Californians are going to recall him. People are getting ballots sent to their homes where they vote yes or no on the recall. And if they vote yes on the recall, they choose who they want to be the new governor. Governor Gary Newsom is one of the delegates, one of the candidates on there. He's not running under the Democrat line because he's not allowed to. And Larry Elder, you might know him from the Larry Elder Show at the Epoch Times, is actually the front runner right now on there. We'll see what happens with this. There have been some reports of potential fraud taking place. One of the biggest concerns people have found is that if you take the envelopes on the vote yes or vote no, essentially then choosing who you want to be, who the new governor you want, that if you take the envelope and you tap it, allegedly, it'll reveal a person's vote on that. And the concern is that people can basically tap the letters and toss out the ones they don't want. That's the concern. We'll have to see what happens with it. This, again, ties to one of the broader issues that a lot of people are very cautious about whether they want to believe in the integrity of our election system anymore, because government officials did severely, change election laws throughout the United States and severely weaken the standards we have to ensure that fraud does not take place. We'll see what happens with this recall election because it could go either way. And I will say that I know that Larry Elder does seem to be pretty confident that he's going to win, but we'll have to see. I'll keep you all updated on it as we get more information as we go forward. Another question here let's see. This is from George Maupin. You said, would Epoch Times be interested in the title Discovery of Genesis in the Chinese language? I'm actually not familiar with this. I could check it out, though. Another question here is from Yan T, or Jan T. You said Biden family interest in CCP energy and the Iran through Afghanistan to China pipeline answers why Biden's sucking up to Taliban current events. That's an interesting take. We do know that, of course, Hunter Biden has made significant business deals with the Chinese Communist Party, that he has made business deals with Ukraine related to energy, and that they've, of course, lifted some of the different restrictions we placed on Iran, which has allowed Iran very likely to once again become one of the larger state sponsors of terrorism yet again. We'll have to see where it goes. But we do see that they've dismantled basically U.S. independence on oil while moving essentially the entire oil business to Russia, where we're having to buy oil again from Russia and other countries, which just happens. And then, of course, Hunter Biden, of course, has a very large business deal with one of the energy companies in that area. Maybe they're going to make some money off this. I don't know. We'll have to see. But we do see a lot of discrepancies with this. We do see a lot of very, let's say, concerning issues with this. And actually, that's some great analysis with that. We'll have to see what comes out. Again, I'll keep you updated. But we do know that the Chinese Communist Party, very likely, based on some very good analysis we've had, the Chinese Communist Party very likely is going to try to build an oil pipeline going through Afghanistan from Iran. That is, according to some good experts. We might remember we had Gregory Copley on in a recent panel talking about this. Based on some very credible information that does appear to be the interest of the CCP, at least part of it, on this. All right, last question, then we'll go into some last stories. This is from Jack Mofer. You said, hey, Josh, did you see Biden checking his watch today at Dover Air Force Base when fallen soldiers came home? He was late for his nap. I didn't see the video of him checking his watch. I did watch the video of him allegedly falling asleep during his meeting with the, I believe, Israeli Prime Minister. And so it's unfortunate that him looking like he wants to get out of there or not be there or take a nap while he's having important meetings. We'll see, folks. There's some strange stuff going on and some bizarre stuff going on. All right, folks, I want to talk real quick some more news stories, though. I want to talk about what's happening with the January 6th Commission, because something that's happening right now with the January 6th Commission could very likely affect the data of people who had nothing to do whatsoever with January 6th, and very likely going to be feeding the broader narrative, the broader political push, I should say, of people who they're trying to label as extremist. Now, briefly on this, of course, January 6th refers to the Capitol siege or Capitol Great Walkthrough, depending on what you want to call it, where, again, when the Electoral College votes were being counted, people illegally entered the U.S. Capitol building. Most people, well, almost all the cases now of people who are being tried and facing charges, again, for entering the Capitol building are being found guilty on basically trespassing charges, meaning in terms of crime, literally it's trespassing, meaning it literally was the great walkthrough of the Capitol building. But the House Democrats formed a committee to investigate that, although the Senate did not vote to do it. Now, it was going to be originally a bipartisan commission, a bipartisan committee to investigate the January 6th incident. The delegates the Republicans put up to be on that committee were not accepted by Nancy Pelosi, who instead chose to bring on two Republicans who had previously voted to impeach Trump, meaning that it's not really bipartisan. It's bipartisan based on partisan politics, but not bipartisan based on, well, real Republicans who are siding with the Republican Party movement. These are people who sided with the Democrats, who are Republicans but have sided with the Democrats. And so it's not really bipartisan. In other words, all the people on the commission right now, all the people in this committee are people who have already publicly made clear their stance on January 6th. They already made clear their stance on it through their votes, again, on that, on the move to impeach Trump or not. And they all voted yes to impeach Trump. But it says here, and this is important, January 6th committee seeks records from 15 tech platforms. And this means that the records they're going to be getting very likely are going to exceed just what was happening at the Capitol siege, as they're calling it. It says here, the Democrat Majority Committee probing the events that unfolded at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th had issued letters to 15 telecommunications and social media companies, including giants such as Facebook, Twitter, and Google, asking them to provide a series of documents related to the day. The other platforms being targeted in the records demanded are 4chan, 8kun, formerly known as 8chan, Gab, Parler, Reddit, Snapchat, which claims to keep your communications private, Telegram, the Donald.win, TikTok, again under ByteDance, a Chinese company, Twitch, YouTube, and Zello. In other words, just about every major possible source they can get, every social media platform, and some that aren't even social media platforms, are going to have to provide information on their users to this committee. Now it says here, according to a statement from the select committee, Representative Benny Thompson, a Democrat, its chairman, is giving the companies 2 weeks to provide information, including records related to the spread of misinformation, as they're calling it, efforts to overturn the 2020 election or prevent certification of the results. In other words, if you were promoting overturning the election results, meaning you were challenging the outcome of the 2020 election, you're under this. This is part of the information they're seeking. What they call domestic violent extremism, which they're grouping in with those kinds of people, and foreign influence in the 2020 election. And they say specifically the committee is seeking a range of records, including data, reports, analysis, and communications. Meaning if they're going to these companies, that means records that include data, meaning user data very likely, reports, analysis, meaning people are writing analysis or doing analysis on users from these companies, and communications, meaning your communications or the company's communications, going back again to the spring of 2020. It is also seeking information on policy changes that the social media companies adopted or failed to adopt to address the spread of false information, as they call it, violent extremism, and foreign malign influence, including decisions on banning material from platforms in contacts with law enforcement and other government entities. Meaning that as part of this as well, they're going to be trying to, it seems, pressure these companies to censor or ask why they were not censoring this type of information. Raising again the bigger question of whether these social media companies are still independent, whether you can still have free speech on these social media platforms when government is pressuring them to censor information based on government narrative. Now, Facebook, in a statement to multiple outlets, confirmed it had received the documents request, adding that it looks forward to working with the committee. Snapchat, which notably claims to keep your communications private, and Reddit issued similar comments. Google, which owns YouTube, also confirmed receipt of the letter and said it would cooperate with the request. It called the events of January 6 unprecedented and tragic, adding that Google and YouTube, quote, strongly condemn them. And they said this in a statement: we're committed to protecting our platforms from abuse, including rigorously enforcing our policies for content related to the events of January 6th. And Twitter declined to comment in a statement. Gab, meanwhile, the CEO, Andrew Torba, confirmed that he received the letter from the committee and said the company has a zero-tolerance policy towards threats of violence and unlawful speech. Separately, 8kun, also known as 8chan, the owner of that, Jim Watkins, confirmed he received the committee's letter in a post on Telegram and also shared a screenshot of the first page of the letter. Now, Thompson said in a statement that the select committee is, quote, examining the facts, circumstances, and causes of the attack, as they're calling it, and relating to the peaceful transfer of power, in order to identify and evaluate lessons learned and to recommend corrective laws, policies, procedures, rules, or regulations. Now, keep in mind, again, based on the information they're getting from pretty much every single social media outlet that has any weight whatsoever, based on the information they're getting on communications, chats, discussions, everything, they're going to be recommending policy changes while also asking about these companies' policies on allowing people to have open discussion on information, like, for example, the integrity of the elections. Now, keep in mind, going back to 2016, which organizations, which politicians, and which media organizations were talking about the idea that maybe there was fraud in the elections? The other side of the aisle. So was that also on par with this? Was that, again, you're the president of the United States at that time, with the peaceful transfer of power to Trump in 2016 when he was president? Were the actions taken by social media networks, big tech, by media organizations, and by politicians, were those also insurrectionist type elements? Were those also people advocating for violent extremism as they went and protested on the streets and burned down buildings? Will that also be on par with that, or is this strictly a partisan issue? And again, one of the big questions is going to be whether this is, in fact, just a partisan issue. Because again, the only people allowed on this committee were people who voted previously to impeach Trump. Meaning they already have pre-stated political positions on the nature of the January 6th protests. Now, folks, they say the sweeping request included seeking archived communications from the Trump White House as well. And the former president, Trump, said in a statement, accused the committee of carrying out a partisan exercise at the expense of long-standing legal principles of privilege. Folks, I'll keep you all updated on this because there's a lot happening right now and a lot of stories to go into. Again, I'm doing these live Q&As every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. And again, I'm still on the road, which is why I have a library behind me. I'm actually at a school right now. It's a school for the arts in San Francisco, as a matter of fact. I'm going to be traveling again back home. And so this coming Tuesday, I'll hopefully be broadcasting from my good old-fashioned chair in front of my bookcases. And I'll see you all then this coming Tuesday. Now, folks, that said as well, if you want to get some great content, you want to see our exclusive interviews and our exclusive documentaries and investigations, also check out Epoch TV, epochtv.com/Crossroads. It's one of the best ways to support us. If you want to donate to this channel as well, we do have donor box, and so we appreciate it. We're still totally demonetized, and so, of course, we appreciate any support. But Epoch TV also has a lot of other great channels there. Definitely check them out. And we also have our new special series, which is called The Dark Origins of Communism. So be sure to check that out as well. And again, if you want a free trial, all you need is an email address. All right, folks, that said, as always, it's always a pleasure doing these lives. I always enjoy talking with y'all. Please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.